That song is called The Greatest Command, and it took me the longest time to figure out what's going on in that song. And basically the title comes, from Jesus' command to love one another. But in 1 John 4, verses 7 and 8, you have the origin of love, that God is love, and he who does not love is not born of God, is not of God, because God is love. But then they add to that 1 Corinthians 13, which defines love. Love's not puffed up, it suffers long and believes all things, endures all things, and that kind of thing. So as you add to the command to love, you add the definition to that in the song. And then finally they add also Deuteronomy 6:5, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. So all of those passages, and Jesus quoted that in Mark 12 and verse 30, all of those passages are brought together to explain the command to love and what love is and how you do that practically. Well, that's what I want to get to in our study today. 1 Timothy 4 and verse 12, be an example to the believers. And we talked about in our words yesterday, we're going to add to that the next thing that Paul says today. Say it with me, Psalm 118, verse 24, this is the day the Lord has made. We will rejoice and be glad in it. Remember Hebrews 3 and verse 13, but exhort one another daily while it is called today, lest any of you be hardened through the deceitfulness of sin. Well, the first thing I want to do is I want to bring up a different Bible program here, because I want you to see the difference as the various translations look at 1 Timothy 4 and verse 12. And I think that will help us understand where we're going in today's study. So in 1 Timothy chapter 4 and in verse 12, the Apostle Paul is admonishing a young evangelist, Timothy. He says, let no man despise thy youth. Now, I have this brought up in the old King James Version, close to the 1611 King James Version. Let no man despise thy youth, but be thou an example of the believers in word, in conversation, in charity, in spirit, in faith, in purity. Now, we talked about in word in our last study and having to do with speech and what we say. In the King James, the next thing it says is in conversation. Now, when you and I use the word conversation, we would be talking about what we said the first time, in word. That's not what was meant here in the King's English of 1611. And so if you look at it, for example, in the New King James Version, it says in conduct. You're going to see that in nearly all the later translations. In the New American Standard, in conduct. In the English Standard Version, in conduct. And to me, one of the easiest ways to see the overall message of this verse, if you look at the New Living Translation, it simply says this: don't let anyone think less of you because you are young. Be an example to all believers in what you say, in the way you live, in your love, your faith, and your purity. Now, to me, that is just an easy way to understand the direction that Paul is going in these commands to Timothy. So let's talk about what it means to be an example to the believers, and by extension to all people, in conduct. Well, there are many things in the New Testament that talk about the Christian's conduct. So I want to just, in the few minutes that we have, talk about some practical ways that we need to be an example to the believers in our conduct. I want to start in 1 Peter chapter 1 and verse 16, which will lead us to a couple of other passages, and just talk about, what this leads to when Paul says be an example in conduct. Okay, so in 1 Peter 1, verse 13, Peter says, "Gird up the loins of your mind, be sober, and rest your hope fully upon the grace that is to be brought to you at the revelation of Jesus Christ as obedient children, not conforming yourselves to the former lust as in your ignorance, but as he who called you is holy, you also be holy in all your conduct, because it is written, be holy, for I am holy." Where is it written? Well, I'll tell you one place it's written over and over, and that is in the book of Leviticus. If you haven't read Leviticus lately, granted, it's a hard read. There are a lot of things in there that pertain particularly to the old law, but there are many things in there, as you can see from Peter's writing, that are perpetually true and applicable in every dispensation. So he says it's written. We go back to Leviticus 11. In verse 44, God said to Israel, "For I am the Lord your God. You shall therefore consecrate yourselves, and you shall be holy, for I am holy." These two words have to do with setting yourself apart from everything around you that's common. The word consecrate, you can see here in Strong's definition. You be clean ceremonially or morally. Consecrate, dedicate, hallow. So you're going to be separate, and you shall be holy. Again, this is a word that means sacred. It has to do with that which is the opposite of that which is common. So he says you're to consecrate yourself and be holy. Neither shall you defile yourselves with any creeping thing that creeps on the earth. For I am the Lord who brings you up out of the land of Egypt to be your God. You shall therefore be holy, for I am holy. And he talks there about the law of animals for the Israelites under the old law. And, many of these things, I don't know if we can show definitively that they were, for health reasons. Many of I have a feeling they may be, because we just keep finding more and more, evidence that these laws were not arbitrary. They had real benefits, in various ways. But all of that aside, the main purpose, the goal of God's laws here were to set Israel aside from all the people around her. You see that in verse 47. This is the law of the animals, and he says to distinguish between the unclean and the clean, and between the animal that may be eaten and the animal that may not be eaten. As you looked around, you would see Israel wouldn't eat the same things as all her neighbors. And he says that over and over, Leviticus 19, Leviticus 20. And if you want a modern day application, when Paul begins the 12th chapter of Romans, he says, "I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, wholly acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service. And do not be conformed to the world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God." When people look at you as a Christian, they should see something different than the world around them. Well, how else do we show God that we're an example to the believers in our conduct? Well, in 1 Peter, and let's look at chapter 2 this time in verse 11. Peter says, "Beloved, I beg you as sojourners and pilgrims, abstain from fleshly lusts which war against the soul, having your conduct honorable among the Gentiles, that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may by your good works which they observe glorify God in the day of visitation. So if you're reading the King James, I think it says honest there, but honest and honorable go hand in hand, don't they? But he says, have your conduct honorable. How do you do that? Well, in sports, they'll teach you how to be honorable. For example, if you lose the game, honorable conduct means you go up and you shake the hands of the victor. That's just an honorable thing to do. My wife and I came out of a store the other day, and we looked at my wife noticed on the passenger side front of her car, somebody had hit it. Looked like they just put their tire against it and just kept going and just made these marks all around the fender. But who did it, we'll never know. Now, if a Christian does that, what's the honorable thing to do? Leave a note, tell them what you did, give them information how to contact you. That's the honorable thing to do. If we're going to be an example to the believers and by extension to all the world around us, we're going to have our conduct honorable among all that see us. Let's look at another example, practical example of honorable conduct, or in this case, we're going to see another word that's used by Peter in 1 Peter chapter 3. As he begins there, he speaks to the wives. He says, "Wives, likewise you be submissive to your own husbands, that even if some do not obey the word, they without a word may be won by the conduct of their wives." Now he's talking about here being won to Christ. By the conduct of their wives, when they observe your chaste conduct accompanied by fear. Chaste means restrained, and it means a person that's pure in thought. We a lot of times we relegate the word chaste to someone that keeps themselves from sexual impurity. That's true, but that's not the broad meaning of the word. It means that a person that is in general restrained in their conduct, and that they are pure in their very thoughts. So here Peter says one who is chaste, pure in their conduct, can even win a spouse, a husband, to Christ without saying a word, because their conduct does the talking. They don't have to use their words. Now, as you continue down there in 1 Peter chapter 3, when you get down to verse 13 beginning, he says, "And who is he who will harm you if you become followers of what is good? But even if you should suffer for righteousness' sake, you're blessed, and do not be afraid of their threats, nor be troubled, but sanctify the Lord God in your hearts, and always be ready to give a defense to everyone who asks you a reason for the hope that is in you, with meekness and fear, having a good conscience, that when they defame you as evildoers, those who revile your good conduct in Christ may be ashamed." So you see, good conduct leads to a good conscience, and you don't have to worry about what people will say about you and what God's estimation of you is. So these are just a few practical ways that having your conduct in line with what God says, that's how we are an example to the believers and by extension to the world. A couple other passages that I have in the description are Philippians 3 and Philippians 4, where it talks about the fact that we're not of this world, our calling is heavenly, and so we're to think on heavenly things. I hope these things will inspire all of us to be an example, to have our lives right with the Lord so that others can see that, and we'll make a difference. As Jesus said in Matthew 5, "Let your light shine before the world, that others may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven." Is your conduct honorable? Is your conduct holy? Is it restrained and good? And does it show that you are looking to heaven, not to this earth, as